Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to the Museums of the Bethel Historical Society. My name is Will Chapman. I'm the archivist here at the Museums of the Bethel Historical Society. It's one of my many job titles, but both official and unofficial. But we're here today to celebrate the launch of Diggio, Haybis Korpus, and Plewrisy Unicorn, the Thinkin and Doin of Ethan Spike of Hornby, Oxford County, Maine. And Larry's going to be telling you all about Ethan Spike and his creator, Matthew Franklin Whittier, in just a moment. So my job is to introduce Larry, although I suspect that he's probably well known to many of you. But Larry graduated from Bridgeton, Maine High School back in the days when there actually was a Bridgeton High School. He received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a master's from Harvard University, and enjoyed a long career, first in education and later as a data systems administrator. Throughout this period, he spent a good deal of his spare time indulging his passion for historical research and writing. He has written, compiled, and collaborated on the publication of numerous books, articles, and reference works relating to the history and culture of Western Maine. In 2006, he was awarded the Maine Historical Society's James Finney Baxter Award for Historical Writing. And in 2014, he received the Society's Neil W. Allen Jr. Award for Historical Research. Some of his recent publications include Oxford County Indeed, People and Places of Oxford County, Maine, 2013, Maine's Black Population in the Census of 1790 and 1800, published in 2014. And I first got the chance to work with Larry on a book called Addison Barrell's Greenwood, which the Bethel Historical Society and the Greenwood Historical Society co-published in 2016 on the anniversary, the bicentennial of Greenwood's establishment. Larry edited that together with Herb Adams, who I'm sure many of you also know. More recently, Larry was one of the contributors to the first issue of our new history journal, Blueside, which we launched earlier this year. He wrote an article on the early Twitchell Purchase and Raymond Grant in Greenwood and the founding grants of the town. This is available in the shop. It goes out to all of our members. It's also available in the shop for $15 a piece. And the books, which we have here today, we are going to be selling for $24.95. After Larry's talk is concluded, he'll be able to sign books out there, and we'll ask that you take them into the shop to purchase them, and that way you can use a credit card or however you would like to do it. So, without further ado, here's Larry.
Thank you very much, Will. Really, this is the beginning of the Museums of the Bethel Historical Society's open sessions. As you know, there's been a pandemic, you may have heard, and the Society was closed for some time, but we're now having some public events, and the purpose of having this particular one today, as a matter of fact, in this building was because to get these things underway, they wanted to have really small crowds, so they thought a really totally obscure subject such as this one really keep the crowd down, but maybe they misjudged. I don't know, this is a really nice turnout. Before I proceed, everybody should know that the nearest restroom is in the building over here through the center door and to the left. This is, oh, there's plenty of seats right here in front. Come on, sit
I
down.
don't want to interrupt.
You're just in time. So, our subject today is Ethan Spike. I will say I prefer to run these talks, and I've done a number of them, from memory rather than from paper. But I ask you to bear with me today. For one thing, the memory isn't what it used to be. And for another, I have to coordinate what's on the paper with what's on the screen, and if I didn't have what's on the paper, it would get lost and be unhappy. So, subject today is Ethan Spike. We're going to take a short look at this satirical character from 150 years ago. But just as a starter, I think we might want to think about what satire is supposed to be and how it's supposed to work. So if this works well.
One of the hottest tickets in New York these days is for the treasures of Tutankhamun, the Egyptian king who died in 1325 BC. The ancient relics that were buried with the boy king are on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And here to report on this exhibition is correspondent Rosanna Day. Mr. Richard Bader from Farley, New Jersey, writes in and says, "Dear Rosanna Day, I keep reading about King Tut. Who is this Tut? What's so special about this Tut? Did you see Tut? Should I see Tut? What kind of name is Tut? Did you know that Tut spelled backwards still spells Tut? Do you think that Tut will ever come to my town? Mr. Bader, this king got enough problems being dead. Don't make it worse by making him go to New Jersey." Mr. Bader, you wrote to the right lady. Because I, Rosanna Dana, went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art right here in New York City to see the Tut exhibit. And I really learned a lot of neat things. You know, Mr. Bader, the Egyptians believe that when you die, you're not really dead. You just go to another place. So they bury people with all their stuff so they don't have to shop when they get there. Anyway, this King Tut was just a kid when he died, but they buried him with some very expensive pottery bowls and some razzle-dazzle golden masks, and even his very own cute little teeny tiny chair. But then I said to myself, Rosanna Dana, if his tiny chair is here in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that means that little Tut is walking around in the afterlife with no place to sit down. So he's been standing around for 3,000 years. So anyways, I was walking around and looking at everything, and like in this one glass case, they had this little King Tut fancy gold plate or something. And I was trying to get a close look at it, pressing my nose up against the glass and fogging it up with my breath and everything, wiping it off and fogging it up again. When I noticed my tongue was all green from eating this Florex mint to give me good breath. And I kept trying to scrape the green off of with my teeth like this, you know, like that. And then my teeth got green on, I tried to scrape that. I thought I was going to die. Here I am in this Ritzy Culture Museum with a green tongue. But you know what really makes me sick? Did you ever look underneath your tongue? It's all blue and white and pink and real soft and bumpy, and it's got this real thin piece of skin that you're always afraid it's going to rip and go around. Shut up.
So, can I make this go blank? Or
Yep, just hit the space bar so it doesn't keep playing.
There we go.
Yep,
Okay.
just hit the space bar so it doesn't keep playing.
Okay. So, Rosanna Dana, that is a satirical character that most of us, I think, can remember from our lifetimes. That was about 50 years ago. And when you look back at something like that, the questions are, well, you know, who was Rosanna Dana? But in order to understand what she's talking about there, you need to understand something about 1979, which most of us can do just from our own memory. But the details that are included in this little talk, if you wait another 100 years or so, might not be quite so understandable at all, which is where we are from Ethan's Spike, 150 years. So, you know, was there really a King Tut exhibit in New York in 1979? Well, yeah, there was, sure. And how about the green tongue? It turns out that the breath savers were just introduced that year, and they were doing lots of advertising on TV, and they had a little green spot in the middle, you know, so when you put one in your mouth, it turns green. And how about New Jersey? You know, making fun of New Jersey? Maybe I shouldn't go there since I myself was born in New Jersey, but we all get that joke. The point is, in order to understand satire, you have to know something about the history that existed at the time. And for a short time ago, it's easy. For a long time ago, it's not so easy. We have some other folks coming in here, and I think we have 3 seats for them. So we'll have them arrive, and we'll have them sit down. And
We got some seats for you right in front. Hello there.
It'll be worth the wait, believe me. Hello, Joanna. Nice to see you. We have 3 seats for you right here.
Thank you. Sorry, we're a little late. We came to school.
Those things happen. It's a long way from Shaker Village in many ways.
Good.
I'm embarrassed, I'll sit down.
Okay. Well, what you missed, you folks who just came in, were 2 things. One is information that the nearest restroom is in the yellow building to the left. And secondly, you missed a very funny Rosanna clip. I'm sorry, we can't rerun it. The question raised by Rosanna was, what do you need to know in order to understand a satire? And the bottom line is, the further back you go in history, the more you have to know about the historical period, or the satire doesn't make sense anymore. It had to be there. And hopefully, part of today's talk will help you to be there 150 years ago when Matthew Franklin Whittier was writing about Ethan Spike. The whole point of satire, I think, is that it's in a way it's like a time capsule, or a piece of ancient amber that has a funny insect stuck in there that doesn't exist anymore. And Ethan Spike actually is like that. He's like a funny looking insect that is stuck in some sort of amber time. We'll try to figure that out. Over a period of about 40 years, Matthew Franklin Whittier wrote about 135 letters under the name of Ethan Spike. In these letters, we get to see, at least from the perspective of Spike, what was going on in his time. He writes a letter about, actually more than one, about spiritualism, what was going on with that, the gold rush, the fugitive slave law, the wreck of a ship in Casco Bay, and the bandits from places like Cape Elizabeth that ran down to the beach. The bandits from places like Cape Elizabeth that ran down to the beach to steal what was washing ashore. The capture of Jefferson Davis, there's a letter about that. Some of these subjects are just silly, like getting sick on ice cream, or a spelling bee in Hornby, Oxford County, Maine, where nobody can quite figure out how to spell the word dog. Does it have a W in it? 2 G's? Not sure. But at the same time, there's some very serious stuff going on in his letters as well. In 1873, for example, Ethan Spike writes about, almost simultaneously in the same week in 1873, there were a large group of black voters in Louisiana who were simply murdered by white vigilantes because they didn't like to have black people voting. And in that very same week, there was a band of Indians out in California who were basically trying to mind their own business, and they were massacred by some of our troops. Some of that stuff is very serious, and the fact of the matter is that the book, that if you should buy and read the book, you need to know that a lot of what's coming out of the mouth of Ethan Spike in 1840 and 50 and 60 is just as nasty now, maybe even nastier than it was then. So this isn't a fireside read, and it's not a children's book, and you need to be ready when you turn the pages to understand what's happening in 1840, 50, and 60. So this is Matthew Franklin Whittier as a young man. Rather innocent-looking character, don't you think? And how he came to write Ethan Spike, that's one of the questions today. There are 3 images of Matthew Franklin Whittier on display at the Whittier Home and Museum in Amesbury, Massachusetts, which is a very nice little museum in a very nice little town, should you happen to be able to get there. But the focus of the Whittier Home and Museum in Amesbury, Massachusetts is not Matthew Franklin Whittier, it's his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier. And as a matter of fact, there's more in that museum about Matthew Franklin Whittier's daughter than there is about Matthew Franklin Whittier himself, because the daughter the niece of John Greenleaf Whittier, helped him through his later years. And when John Greenleaf Whittier died, it was the daughter and her husband who got the house and maintained it, and then gave it to a charitable organization to run as a museum today. So John Greenleaf Whittier, Lizzie Whittier are very important figures there. And if you hear the tour, you'll hear a lot about them. You don't hear very little about Matthew Franklin Whittier. And explains really a lot of the relationship he had with his family. Unfortunately, John Greenleaf Whittier was a superstar of his day, and Matthew Franklin Whittier was maybe a footnote somewhere, maybe. Almost every job that Matthew Franklin Whittier ever had in his life, and they were mostly clerical positions in shipping operations or for the customs service, he got through the political influence of his brother. And I suspect, although it's hard to find the actual documentation, I suspect that very few of Matthew Franklin Whittier's writings would even appear in print if it weren't for the literary and publishing connections of his brother. A lot of newspapers would very much like to publish anything that's remotely associated with John Greenleaf Whittier, because they could say, oh, here's a letter from Ethan Spike, written by John Greenleaf Whittier's brother. So I think it was probably difficult for Matthew and the family. His life, and you can read more about it in the introduction to the book, was not a very smooth one. It had its ups and many downs, and maybe even perhaps more downs than ups. So this is him as a youngster. The painting actually was made about the same time that each member of the family. There were 4 children of the family, and they all have a portrait from about this same time. So we don't think that it was Matthew Franklin Whittier who paid to have this done, and this sort of thing was expensive in the day. It was more likely the family said, oh, we need to get this done, so, you know, hey, could you sit down for a while and we'll do this? But the most important thing about Matthew Franklin Whittier's family is that it was a politically and socially involved family in Massachusetts at the time. They were Quakers, and they were serious practicing Quakers. They called each other thee and thou and so on. And the ideas that John Greenleaf Whittier, the political ideas that he was working on through his career, were shared by Matthew Franklin Whittier. They were virtually identical. They were, number one, abolition. They were both very strong abolitionists. They were also temperance people. And they were social reformers of many different types for women's rights and black rights and so on and so forth. So a lot of what's in Matthew Franklin Whittier's writing, which are the letters of Ethan Spike, are those ideas. And you can read the same ideas in poetical form in what his brother was doing at the same time. So that may be interesting enough, but I think the really interesting question about Matthew Franklin Whittier is how did he happen to come up with Hornby, Oxford County, Maine, as the place where all these writings were going to come from? A moth. It wasn't difficult in his time. Again, if you understand what was happening at the time, it was almost natural. From about 1805 until at least the Civil War, Oxford County, Maine was really the beating heart of Jefferson-Jackson politics in Maine. And up until 1820, of course, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So this part of the state produced a whole line of very, what we would call today maybe right-wing or nativist or they might call themselves patriotic or so on, family people. Even, you know, Hannibal Hamlin began as a Jeffersonian Democrat from Oxford County. The county produced several governors and several representatives and senators and so on, and they were all cut right from that same cloth. Exactly the same kind of cloth that the intelligentsia in Amesbury and Boston and Portland would think were probably not very well educated, certainly they didn't have the right ideas going on in their head, As a matter of fact, what they were talking about and the kinds of ideas that they stood for, ideas like, why should we bother the Southerners about slavery, for heaven's sakes? It's not affecting us, and we don't want them to bother us, we won't bother them. Easy. And ideas like that were not ideas that John Greenleaf Whittier or Matthew Franklin Whittier wanted to put up with. And yet they seemed to flower in this part of the state, probably because it was rural, certainly economically because there was always a conflict between the rural agrarian parts of New England and the urban mercantile parts. It was the rural agrarian people who felt they were doing all the work and being ripped off by the mercantile people down in along the coast to try to get the most for the least out of them, and seemed to be getting very wealthy at the same time. So it was social tension, political tension, religious tension. The people who lived in this area were predominantly Baptist, Methodist, Universalists. The people along the coast were virtually all Congregationalists. It would be almost natural to say, if you want to have a satirical character who everybody in the country, certainly everybody in New England, but perhaps even everybody in the country would recognize as coming from a place that is full of people who are stupid, have it be Oxford County, Maine. And so that's kind of natural. Exactly how he came up with the name of Hornby is also very interesting and politically connected and intricate. If you read the introduction, you can see that in detail. That's one of the details we don't really have time to get into today. We have other things to cover. But the town of Hornby was the sort of place like Rosanna Dana's New Jersey that people of the day would understand as a place you want to make fun of, even though nobody was quite sure exactly where it was. Matthew Franklin Whittier decided, oh, okay, I need to have a place that has stupid people in it, and I need to have them coming from a stupid town, so I'll take the stupid town and I'll put it in the stupid place, which was Oxford County, Maine. Maybe, as a matter of fact, just a stone's throw from Bethel. There's lots of references in the book to Hornby, the town that, I think we have Hornby here. Yes, here we go, Hornby. Hornby is located just over the hill, or just two rows of apple trees separated from Bethel Village, and you can see the arrow there points to exactly where Hornby was. You can figure that out. So one of the larger questions, though, about Matthew Franklin Whittier and Hornby in Oxford County is, did Matthew Franklin Whittier ever come here? He lived in Portland for about 20 years, working at various clerical jobs that his brother got for him. He started living in Portland around 1840, 41, 42, and he lived there through about 1854 or 1855. And in 1851, the Grand Trunk Railroad finished the lines from Portland up here to Bethel. And in Portland at the time, it became a fun daily or weekend event to take an excursion up to Bethel in the mountains and so on, and then get on the train and come back home again. It was one of the fashions of the day. And if Matthew Franklin Whittier is living in Portland at the time, in the last 3 or 4 years of his stay in Portland, the railroad was running. His editor at the Portland Transcript, where he published most of the letters that he wrote, was Edward Elwell, who was very actively involved in White Mountain and Western Maine outdoor life. It just seems natural that he must have come up here at some point, or maybe even more than one point, and probably knew people here, so on. His brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, spent a lot of time in the White Mountains. They had a family friend, Lucy Larcom, who you may not have heard of, but she at the time was a very well-known poet who came to Bethel regularly in the summertime. And again, if Matthew Franklin's in Portland and Lucy Larcom's up here, and they're close, I mean, he almost had to have come up, but we have not yet found the daguerreotype image of Matthew Franklin Whittier and his brother John Greenleaf sitting on the steps of the hotel, which was across the street on the green. Should you happen to find that in your attic or in your basement someplace, please let us know. We'd very much like to have it. But as of the current moment, there's no direct evidence that Matthew Franklin Whittier ever came to Bethel. But his mind was here, his pen was here, and his principal character came from probably just over the hill, I think. So another interesting question about Matthew Franklin Whittier and Ethan Spike. I mentioned that we only have, there are 3 images of Matthew Franklin Whittier in the museum in Amesbury, and there's one other that's floating around the internet you can find. None of them are actual photographs. So there's some images of Matthew Franklin Whittier, but no photographs. And likewise for Ethan Spike, there's no picture anyplace, no editor or artist or anyone ever decided that they're going to draw a picture of Ethan Spike, which is unfortunate because to fix the image of a person in your head that you might remember, it helps to have a picture. If you don't have something to see, it's hard to see. Rosanna Dana, for example, all I have to do is say the name and that picture comes into everybody's head, I think. At least everybody who's at least 75 years old, like I am. But for Ethan Spike, who may have lived longer in the memory of Americans, such a picture doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, we put this on the cover of the book because we're pretty sure that this person right here, that's Ethan Spike. And that's as close as we can get to what he actually looked like. And he's right on the cover of the book. As another example of satire, this is a cartoon, a political cartoon, that actually focuses on probably the principal subject that Matthew Franklin Whittier cared about, which was slavery. And you see across the top, it says, this is a white man's government. And we have several white men, including, you'll notice this is an Irish person. You can satirize the subjugation of black people, but at the same time you're sort of doing a left-hand satirization of Irish people too. I don't know if that ever, Thomas Nast ever thought in those terms. Wait a second, if people are people, why is it that this person is being subjugated and that person can be made fun of? Interesting question. But at any rate, this is the white man's government. That was published in 1868 in Harper's Magazine all across the country. Everybody saw it. And that image of this is white man's government got fixed in their heads to the extent that today, if you should Google when you leave here, if you Google white man's government, what will come up will be 5 dozen different examples of this actual cartoon from 1868. The interesting thing is that this is white man's government in 1868 was already a decade old as a phrase that was sort of floating around the country. A senator, I have his name here, Senator, you ready for this name? Excuse me. Senator George Wallace Jones. From, at that time, I don't think any connection to the George Wallace we know, but it's interesting mental connection. He's from Iowa, and in the U.S. Senate, he said, in explaining why it was that we should let the Southerners do whatever they want with their people, he said, this is a white man's government. He said that in the U.S. Senate. It got reported in the papers, and for the next 10 years, quite often you see in the papers some usually derogatory remark to, in the North that is, to this is a white man's government. Now, if this cartoon had not been published, you could Google, this is a white man's government today, and you wouldn't find anything out there. You wouldn't find a thing. Depending on how good your Google is, you might be able to find in the Senate, in the notes of the Senate, from a dozen years earlier that this senator had said this is a white man's government, but you wouldn't, this image can fix that in your head in such a way that it will never disappear. And that's what's happened with that phrase and this cartoon. Now, unfortunately, because, I hope I don't screw this up by trying to go backwards, because this is all we know of Ethan Spike, it's very difficult to imagine even that he would be known today. If we had an artist, a cartoonist out there drawing pictures of him, I think he might very well be. But that person wasn't there. We don't have those images. That's too bad for us. Here are some other examples of images of satirists. This is Major Jack Downing from Downingville, Maine. At that time, Maine was the butt of virtually all satirical humor. The Mainers, if you wanted to make fun of something that was ridiculous, you'd find somebody from Maine. So we have Jack Downing from Downingville, Maine. He was the first superstar satirical character in American history. Andrew Jackson thought he was fantastic. He became so popular. Haybis Smith, who was from Buckfield, Maine, was the originator of Major Jack Downing, and he became so popular, and he was so ripped off at the time. All kinds of people decided that they were going to start writing letters from Major Jack Downing. And Haybis Smith became so upset about that at one point he declared that Major Jack Downing was dead, and he wrote an article describing the funeral and the people from Downingville who had come to it. He tried to put an end to the whole thing. Artemis Ward from Waterford, Maine, this was Charles Brown, Charles Brown with an E on the end, was a spectacularly popular figure during his era, which was shortly before and into the Civil War. He died as a very young man in England, but his body was brought back to Waterford, so on your way home, if you're going back, you can stop in Waterford and see his grave. He was phenomenally successful, and everybody, you wouldn't need this in those days, everybody would know who he was, everybody would know who he was, and even Mrs. Ruth Partington, who was from Spunkville, off east someplace. Spunkville wasn't necessarily in Maine, but it was down east there someplace. She was also a very popular character, and the person who created Mrs. Partington happened to be the editor of the Carpetbag magazine in Boston, which was one of the first that published the works of Matthew Franklin Whittier and Samuel Clemens and Artemis Ward. So at one point, Artemis Ward and Samuel Clemens and Matthew Franklin Whittier were all writing for the same, the first American humor magazine in Boston. And the creator of the magazine, his name was Shilobar, he was from Portsmouth, created Mrs. Ruth Partington as his satirical character. But again, every one of these has an image. So if you Google Major Jack Downing, you'll find a lot. If you Google Artemis Ward, you'll find libraries full of information. Even if you Google Mrs. Ruth Partington, which I've done, you come up with many dozens of references, and you'll come up with this picture and so on. But again, if you Google Ethan Spike, almost nada, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned. So, let's just turn to some of the satire that Ethan Spike was bringing forth and Matthew Franklin Whittier was interested in. Here we have, I guess I should introduce this by saying there's a category of things that Matthew Franklin Whittier and his Ethan Spike character were interested in, beginning with the smallest and going up to the largest. And maybe this is on the smaller side, the personal side, what people were doing, what people were wearing, what people were eating and drinking, where people were going for their vacations and so on. These top knots, you'll find a letter from Ethan Spike in which the men of Hornby are very upset about top knots. They think they're terrible and something should be done about them. At the time, if you read that, if I just gave you that story, that letter to read, you might just skip right over top knots and with nothing was okay. He makes a biblical reference to why top knots shouldn't be done. But in order to understand what top knots are, you're actually going to have to go back to the newspapers of the day and find out, well, what is top knots about? Just as with Rosanna Diana, to understand what she was talking about, you have to go back to 1979 and was there really a King Tut exhibit and so on. Well, there were. These chignons, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. These have been popular, this hairdo with a bun had been popular for decades. But in the 1860s, excuse me, all of a sudden there was a rage for making them larger and bigger. And they even made bonnets so that the bonnet would have a cutout so that chignon could stand up and so on. Well, it was, it was a ridiculous thing. And so Matthew Franklin Whittier uses a column to make fun of it. Simple. But we also learn a lot about Oxford County by reading these things. One of his pieces was Spanks, a Tale. He was making fun of the very florid writing of the day, just like the Victorian architecture of the day was this Victorian language with full of adjectives and adverbs and la-di-da. And so from Spanks, a Tale, which has to do with Hornby, of course, which is near the Crooked River, of course, because Crooked River starts right over there. The wind roared through the wild and picturesque valley of the Crooked River, and mingling with the swashing of the waves sounded like the eternal symphony of water played on a harp of a few thousand strings, and so on, goes on like that. Again, you might look at that if you're reading the letter from Ethan Spike of the story here, and it's a kind of florid, but in order to actually understand the humor, you have to understand that at that time there was just phenomenal amounts of this going on. And what's more, in Matthew Franklin Whittier's life, the editorship of the Portland Transcript had changed a couple of years earlier. This very liberal and open editor had been replaced by a very conservative and straight-laced kind of guy. And interestingly, at that time, the Portland Transcript stopped publishing works by Matthew Franklin Whittier because he was just a little too out there. So a couple of years later, when the editorial ship flipped back again, and the editor became Edward Elwell, who I mentioned earlier, who liked all this kind of stuff, all of a sudden, almost the first thing that appeared was Spanks, a Tale, and basically what Matthew Franklin Whittier was doing was making fun of those earlier editors who refused to publish his stuff, but published acres and acres and acres of this kind of what we would call today junk. You know, I mean, it's just awful to read. We do learn a lot about Oxford County. We learn about the swashing of the water in the Crooked River. We learn about the Waterford water cure, which is another fad of the day. And if you stop by Artemis Ward's grave, you can check out the building. It's the Waterford Inn down there where the water cure had been originally located. You can take a dip in the brook if you like and see if the water is sort of curing you or whatever. About the old county jail, Ethan Spike spent some time in the old county jail in Paris. Cumberland Oxford Canal plays an important part in a couple of these, and I plugged the reference to the Cumberland Oxford Canal in here because I knew Mr. Brooks would be with us today, the reigning authority, I think, on the Cumberland Oxford Canal.
Modesty prevents my saying.
Well, if you have any questions about the Cumberland Oxford Canal, I have to ask Mr. Brooks. He will slowly turn. And also a very interesting reference, Oxford County, a piece of history that arises in one of Ethan Spike's letters is a reference to a freed slave who settled here in Bethel. And at the time, there actually was a freed slave who was living here in Bethel. She shows up in one of the censuses, I think it's 1870. Her name was Matilda Waters, and she's living at the home of a deputy sheriff, a county deputy sheriff, who had been an officer during the Civil War. So just a bazillion questions, which I've not even, I have no idea what the answers are. I would love to know. How did that all work? That the officer came back and he brought back with him this black woman. Where did she come from? Where did she go afterwards? So on. And what kind of reaction did she cause in the town? And was Matthew Franklin Whittier's or Ethan Spike's letter about these black people, this black family who had settled in town after the war, was that in any way connected to Matilda Waters? Don't know. If you find a letter from Matilda Waters while you're looking for the daguerreotype image of the Greenleaf brothers, let us know. We also learned a lot about Maine history of the day. This is the Great Eastern. This was in 1859, when they started building it, well before that. Launched in 1859. This was the largest vessel on the planet. It was a steam, you can see the steam wheels here, but it also had sails. Built in London, and this was supposed to be able to, idea here was you wanted to have a vessel that could put enough stuff on it so that you could actually get from London to Australia without stopping for any, you know, for having to rely upon places that weren't necessarily politically secure at the time in order to get fuel and food and so on and so forth. This thing was monstrous, and it was going to, its planned destination, well, you know, it was going to travel around the world, but basically it was going to run back and forth between London, between England and the United States, and it was going to shuttle. It actually wanted to, the purpose was to provide Canadian goods from Britain to Canada, but as we all know, because of the winters in this part of the world, you can't get from England to Canada during at least 3 or 4 months of the year because of the ice in the St. Lawrence and so on and so forth. So, as we all know here in Maine, if you want to really get something reliable up to Montreal, you bring it to Portland, and nowadays you put it in a pipeline and ship it up there. But in this day, the notion was they would ship this stuff to East Coast United States someplace, and they would unload it, and then all this stuff would go to Montreal. And needless to say, there was competition for the cities to see where this thing was going to dock. And the big competitors were New York, obviously, Boston, obviously, and Portland, maybe not so obviously. But if you look at the map, I mean, it's the shortest trip is to Portland. And at that time, the Grand Trunk Railroad, which came up to Bethel by 1851, was edging its way closer and closer and closer to Montreal. And as a matter of fact, it was going to easily, I don't know when it arrived in Montreal, it was before 1859. That was the Grand Trunk Railroad, and the Grand Trunk actually got a contract from the Great Eastern people guaranteeing that the Great Eastern would come to Portland. That would become the only stop in North America, and the Grand Trunk would ship all the produce up to Montreal. The Grand Trunk would make a lot of money. Portland was thrilled. The Grand Trunk was thrilled. The Grand Trunk built a huge granite wharf to accommodate this vessel. It was so big, obviously, if you know Portland Harbor, this thing's not getting into the harbor. So they built these colossal wharf things off the end of what's today is Fort Allen Park. If you go to the Eastern Prom and the little gazebo there, and you look down over the hill, you'll see the remains of the big wharf that they built to accommodate the Great Eastern. The Grand Trunk spent a lot of money on those wharfs. The city of Portland spent a lot of money getting ready for the Great Eastern to come. Ethan Spike gets very excited about having the Great Eastern arrive. He writes a letter about the fact that, no, it's not going to New York, it's not going to Boston, it's not even going to stop in Portland, it's going to come through the Cumberland and Oxford Canal right up here to Hornby, Oxford County, Maine. The sad thing is, for Portland, it never came. At the end, the Great Eastern people decided that, well, you know, Maine, maybe, I don't know, but, you know, the New York interests had more connections. The Great Eastern went to New York. It actually didn't function very long. But Portland ended up with these massive wharfs that they didn't know what to do with, and they've since been taken apart. They think they've used the granite blocks for other things around the harbor. It was a very sad day for Portlanders. They actually built ramparts all along where the Eastern Prom is because they were going to have people, there could be a huge outdoor celebration, and they had to have a viewing spot so people could come and see the Great Eastern come in. The Great Eastern never came in. The thing that I like about all of these Ethan Spike letters is just full of this kind of stuff, which a history nerd like me loves. I don't know, you look at it yourself and think that maybe not, but it is just full of information about what was going on, about Oxford County, about the state of Maine. Let's see, they have when the arrival of the telegraph in Portland, worries about the Confederates invading Casco Bay, that was a big concern of the day. The wreck of the Bohemian, and I think the biggest story of them all at that period was the Great Eastern. Nationally, a lot, maybe half or so of the letters Ethan Spike writes have to do with national political issues. And the most common one is on the slavery question and abolitionism. There are lots, you'll see many letters throughout the years, and if you think throughout those years, they began in roughly 1840 with slavery, an absolutely entrenched institution in the United States. They run through the Civil War, and through Reconstruction to, you know, the collapse of Reconstruction and the re-enslavement of black people in the South, you know, legally, if not physically. So the Dred Scott case, fugitive slave laws, and so on show up over and over again. This is William A. Jackson. In one of Ethan Spike's letters, he mentions this, this intelligent body servant of Jefferson Davis, who has since gone absent without leave. He's since disappeared. So when you read something like that, Jefferson Davis has an intelligent body servant who goes AWOL, and you think, well, there must be somebody. So I started looking through the papers to see if I could find who was the intelligent body servant who left Jefferson Davis's household. And I couldn't really find, it was very difficult to find any references to him. I got in touch with this professor at Louisiana State who had, with about 6 or 7 years earlier, had written a biography of Jefferson Davis, and I thought, well, this guy should really know, you know, what's happening in Jefferson Davis's household. And I asked him via email if he could tell me anything about this body servant that Jefferson Davis had who had escaped. And the professor said he never heard of any such thing. Well, that makes the thing even more fascinating, doesn't it? So eventually I was able to track down this intelligent body servant who did in fact work in Jefferson Davis's household and had escaped, crossed the lines. He had gotten hooked up, needless to say, immediately with the abolitionists. They sent him to school in Massachusetts. He got a divinity degree. He became a speaker. He spoke in Portland. He spoke in all through the northern states. He went to England for a period of time and spoke. When he returned, he and his wife went, after the war, he and his wife went back to, I think, Virginia, where they taught in the Freedmen's School, and he was the pastor of the church there and so on. So a really interesting person. This is a picture from Harper's, so you know that nationally he was a, you know, people knew who he was, got a picture in Harper's Magazine, for heaven's sakes. But he completely disappeared. Living on, though, in a story of Ethan Spike. So, as I said, I don't want to repeat myself. I've already done this many times, but these letters are just full of this kind of very interesting material. And another thing I love about Ethan Spike, because I was an English major, you know, so the language, very interesting. I found lots of interesting things in the language. The expressions that Ethan Spike uses were expressions of the day, very well known, most of them completely forgotten today. Up Salt River, everybody in 1850, 60 would have known when you're talking about Up Salt River what we're talking about. Nobody knew where the river was, just like they didn't know where Hornby was. But it was a place you didn't want to be. So any politician who made a grievous error that would end his political career had rowed himself up Salt River. Any politician who found himself in a political box that he couldn't figure out how to get out of, there were people on each side and he didn't know what to do, he was up Salt River. So being up Salt River, it was a political thing. Any politician up Salt River was either in trouble or gone as a politician. Today, I think that would be a very useful expression. Smiling as a basket of chips. A couple of times in his letters, Spike says that people were as smiling as a basket of chips. And how on earth, I've done a lot of searching through a lot of reference books and so on to find out what's so happy with a basket of chips. I mean, today they might have been thinking like, you know, fish and chips or something, but I don't know. And it turns out that the people who have looked for this before have never been able to find where this thing came from or why something was smiling as a basket of chips. But in 1850, if you said, oh, we were smiling as a basket of chips, people would say, oh, you know, it was kind of like the happy face today. Or in a twinkling of a bedpost, which meant quick. So somebody would do something in the twinkling of a bedpost. Where on earth does that come from? But nobody knows. Bowcatcher, maybe we know bowcatcher today. Bowcatcher, was the hairstyles of the day involved curls and so on. And young women who made the curlicues down the sides of their face. They were called bow catchers because if you look just right, you would catch yourself a bow. And that's what they were for. But my favorite of all is this one. You might think that that's some pumpkins, like you can find in the farmer's field, but no. Some pumpkins, did I lose my examples of some pumpkins? It shows up a lot in the papers at the time. Some pumpkins goes something like, I was down in Portland last week, and I'll tell you that town is some pumpkins. The emphasis is always on the some. So it's not some pumpkins, it's some pumpkins. Our militia troop in town is pretty well trained. They get in a fight, they're going to be some pumpkins. Or as Spike says about Gail Hamilton, who was a feminist writer of the day, very outspoken feminist writer of the day. He says, that Gail Hamilton, she is some punks, she is. And I would hope, at the end of this, if all goes well, and you're down in Portland after this talk, that if you should stop somebody on the street and tell them that, hey, that talk I heard up in Bethel on Saturday, that was some pumpkins.
I will.
That would make sense. So obviously a lot of I learned a lot in reading this book, and I hope that you will also learn a lot in reading it as well. You probably don't want to read it cover to cover, just here and there, and just keep it on the shelf and every now and then pick it up. But there are many, many things in Ethan Spike's letters that I have never been able to figure out and would like to, so if you run into these, please let me know. In chapter 27, twice, he talks about the Iniquitous Act. This is 1873. The Iniquitous Act, something as a result of the Iniquitous Act. What could that have possibly been? I have no idea. I've looked and looked and looked and looked, finally had to just give it up, and I think my footnote for Iniquitous Act says, I don't know what this means. Another one is the Hoxie Guard, H-O-X-I-E, the Hoxie Guard. The Hoxie Guard was somehow connected in the Civil War, maybe to the border circumstance between Vermont and Canada. That the letter that this appears in Spike is trying to get out of the country for obvious reasons. He doesn't want to get drafted. And he talks about the Hoxie Guard. Don't know. And here's a puzzler. And this one ought to be easily figurable-outable because of all of the legal research that's available online. Spike refers to the Supreme Court decision having to do with mercury thermometers. I looked through lots and lots and lots of legal stuff to try to find out any reference in anything to any issue having to do with mercury thermometers. The deal was that it was Spike's talking about them because they're no good. It's the alcohol thermometers you want, and the reason Spike wants alcohol thermometers is because anything connected to alcohol, he's happy with. He likes it. No mercury. But what? The Supreme Court decision? I don't know. So, in conclusion, here they are, the Iniquitous Act, the Hoxie Guard, the mercury thermometers. But in conclusion, if you want to know what to get me for Christmas, and I think there are people in this room who might, this is 1868. This is a Boston publisher publishing a card game of humorous authors. And the humorous author cards included cards for Artemis Ward, for Mrs. Partington, here she is, Petroleum Nasby, but also for Jack Downing, and also for Ethan Spike. So out there someplace in some flea market or collection, there is a card game of humorous authors from 1868 that may have the missing picture of Ethan Spike. So, in conclusion, I would like to thank the Society for publishing the book, Will, in particular, who has done almost as much work on the book as I have. Will is responsible for formatting the thing, editing the thing, doing the image work and so on, setting this up today, doing the camera work. And in addition to that, I suspect, and I haven't actually checked with Will on the details of this, but Will's family, Will's a Chapman. The Chapmans have been here in Bethel for a long, long time. Very long time. And I'm going to bet that if we can do the genealogy correctly, we would find that the actual model for Ethan Spike himself was a Chapman. So thank you very much. I appreciate your coming out. I hope you learned a little about Ethan Spike and Matthew Franklin Whittier. And if you happen to decide to own the book, I hope you enjoy some of the writings. And as I said, it's not a children's book, but I hope you like it. Thank you. So we're now going to have the table out there. We'll have some books available, and if people want to buy one, you can go over to the yellow building across. And
Yep, you can just go in the door under the side porch there and into the museum shop.
Yep. And the restroom, which I will spend an hour or so now, so it's in the building over there to the left. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Larry.
Yeah.
Hey, Larry.